All right, we are good to go. So what we're going to do today is we're going to continue our look at perception and finish up our look at the Greebles and the fusiform face area. And then we're going to introduce a very important topic, a new topic, signal detection, to take a look at how do we detect when something is there and how do we detect when something is not there and make that decision. But before we get to that, we do have our step 3 of our social media professional development program. So this is the next step that we're going to take. So far you have a professional account. You are following 3 professional psychology organizations. And we're going to continue that role of connecting to your community, becoming a part of that network. So for this one, what you're being asked to do is to follow 5 psychologists on Twitter. Find 5 Twitter accounts from professional psychologists and follow those psychologists as part of your network. Now, who you choose to follow is completely up to you, and who you choose to follow will be based on your interests. So whatever area of psychology you're interested in, whatever field you might be interested in, for whatever reasons, this is a great opportunity to start following psychologists in that field to become part of their community. So this can be used in a variety of different ways. For example, if you have grad school in your future, if that's what one of your plans are, then you could start following psychologists from grad schools that you might want to apply to. So for example, if you were thinking that maybe you will go to Stanford for their graduate program in psychology, it might be a good idea to use this social media development step 3 to start following some of the psychologists that are working at Stanford. So very nicely, most of these university pages will have information on the interests that these psychologists have. So you can just scroll down, kind of take a look at who's there and what they're doing. And for myself, for example, if I was perusing this website, meaning and mental representation, perception, that's the area of psychology that I'm interested in. So I might decide to start to follow Jamil Zaki. So they have their website. From their website, they either usually have a link to their Twitter account or their full name, making it very easy to find their Twitter account. So for example, I would follow Jamil here, Zaki, and this would be one of the 5 psychologists that I would follow. So you can look at universities that you might want to apply to for grad school. You can go professional organizations that you might want to work for after graduation. So really, it's anything that kind of might serve your career as a psychologist. One other great place, if you're struggling to find psychologists in the area that you're interested in, one other great place to do is to go to the journals that are in your area and look at who's editing those journals, who's on the editorial board. So for example, when I was first getting into comics research, I didn't know the field, I didn't know who the researchers were, but I did know that they had comics research journals. This was one of them, and when I clicked on their editorial board, sure enough, all of those are in comics research. So I started following some of those to help me get into that particular community so that I know what's going on. So that's the assignment for this one. So all you need to do for this one is follow the 5 psychologists and then upload your screenshot, much like we've been doing before, to step 3 psychologists, and that's in Canvas. Assignments, social media professional development, step 3 psychologist. And the due date on this one is Monday, February 10th by midnight. So make sure that you upload those screenshots before that time to earn points for this particular step. And while we're on that, just to make sure that everybody is aware, this is step 3 of the social media professional development. But the other bonus points program, the innovations and suggestions, that is now in week number 2. So now it has 2 components to it. The first component is I put out a link in the announcements for a survey. And the survey link is where you can vote on suggestions that were made last week. So I went to the suggestions that students made in this class, chose 5 of them. There was more than 5. It was great to see. I chose 5 of them. I put them into a Qualtrics multiple choice question, and you just go in and choose the one that you think is the best suggestion, that you think will enhance your learning the most. So that's part of it for this week. The other part is that I've opened up a new suggestion Qualtrics survey where you can enter your innovations and suggestions, generate a new random number, enter in a new suggestion. If your suggestion or innovation wasn't picked the first week, give it another shot. We did have a bunch that first week. It was great to see. So if you want to try the same one again, feel free, absolutely. If you have something new to contribute, absolutely. But just be aware that those 2 components are now available. And that also has, for the suggestions, the Friday at midnight deadline. For the survey, it's going to be the Monday at midnight deadline. Any questions on any of those? All right. So what we're going to do now is we are going to continue on with our look at perception. We are going to start signal detection today, but before we do that, we got to wrap up our first look at perception. And specifically, we were in the middle of discussing experience-dependent plasticity, so we're going to have a real quick recap and take a look at the implications and challenges of that FACES special or trained Greebles study that we saw. So as we mentioned last time, your mind, your brain, actually has the ability to adapt and change depending upon your experiences. So perception is not a passive thing that you do. Perception is an active thing that you do to the environment. And then also, it's an active thing that the environment does to you. So you change the more you look at things. It changes the way your brain is actually wired. It changes the way that your mind works. And experience-dependent plasticity is one of those ways that your mind can change. So your experiences will literally change your brain so that it can process these experiences more efficiently. And we zeroed in on the fusiform face area, which seems to be an area of the brain dedicated to faces, only for faces, only for recognizing human faces. That's when the fusiform face area lights up. So the question was, is this place specialized just for faces? Is this area of the brain just for faces? Or is it for highly trained stimuli? And it just so happens that in our environment, in our day-to-day experiences, faces are the single stimuli that we're the most trained for. It's the single complex stimuli that we get the most training on. So maybe it's just for these highly trained stimuli. So what Gauthier et al. Did is they made new complex stimuli called Greebles, and they ran subjects on identifying these Greebles, identifying the family and identifying the gender of these Greebles, until the subjects became experts in Greeble identification, until they became highly trained on Greeble identification. And what they did is they measured their brain activity to these Greebles and to faces before training. So here we have the activity of the brain. Here we have an image of the activity. Yellow is higher activity, red is higher activity, gray is no activity. And here we have a bar graph indicating the activity of these two areas, and the activity of the fusiform face area in response to Greebles and faces. And as we can see here in the fusiform face area, high response for faces before training, and very low responses or no responses to Greebles before training. And we get that same pattern here. So before training, we have a very high response for faces. We have almost no response for Greebles. However, this all changed after training, because after training, all of a sudden, the fusiform face area started responding to Greebles. So if you look at this bar here, the responding increased. If you look at this area up here, that area started to activate when individuals were looking at Greebles. So a close-up here, now after training, before training, we have no fusiform face area activation for Greebles, high fusiform face area activation for faces. However, after training, all of a sudden, those experts now on Greebles started to show activation for Greebles in the fusiform face area. And then also, before training, almost no activation for Greebles in the fusiform face area. After training, when they were experts, when they could identify this, higher levels of activation in the fusiform face area. And that indicated that training on these Greebles actually increased the processing of the Greebles in that fusiform face area, actually changed what that area processed. All right, so the conclusions that they made from this fusiform face area study with Greebles was that the fusiform face area does respond to faces, but it also responds to other complex stimuli as well. So they showed that it responded to Greebles after Greebles were highly trained. Other studies have shown that your fusiform face area, if you're a car expert, if you're one of those experts that can identify the make and the model and the year of production for all these different types of cars, your fusiform face area will light up when you're looking at cars. If you're a bird expert, somebody that can identify all the species of birds, your fusiform face area will light up when you're looking at birds. So it would seem that it seems pretty clear that this fusiform face area seems to be for highly trained stimuli, not just for faces, but for highly trained stimuli, because we have all these non-face things, including Greebles and cars and birds, that light up the fusiform face area. But of course, if you know anything about psychology, you know this story doesn't end there. So what are some of the challenges that you could possibly foresee? What would be some of the counter arguments that you could make to say or to argue that the fusiform face area really is designed for faces? Yep.
All of those things kind of have faces, like when you look at a car, you kind of see a face on it. Birds have a face, people have a face.
Exactly. So the main criticism of this is that the fusiform face area could be just for faces. And as you train on other stimuli, if they have face-like qualities that you can pick up, then they will be analyzed by the fusiform face area. So the fusiform face area is still analyzing faces. It's just that after training, you see the face-like things in the stimuli that you're looking for. So that is the big challenge. And if you take a look at the stimuli that they've used in these studies, it does not take very much to see the faces. So for example, this is one of the Greebles that was used in the study. And just for comparison, I put googly eyes on it right here so I know where it's at. But that's the other, it's really easy to see in this Greeble that face structure, right? So it has a head, it has a nose, it has hair, right? And if Greebles, very similar to this one, have those same features, then that little bit of activation that we saw in the fusiform face area might just be coming from people realizing, oh, this kind of looks like a face. And because it kind of looks like a face, your fusiform face area would be able to, number one, activate, and number two, be used to learn how to discriminate those particular areas. So that face-like realization might be the reason for this increase. Not that they've changed how the fusiform face area works. It's still for faces. It's just that now they see the face in the other stimuli. So the question after, you mentioned it before about the cars. One of the things that our brain does is our brain really tries to fit things onto the world. Our brain tries to categorize things in the world, and we try really hard to make order in the world. So there's a phenomenon called Pareidolia, where we will see patterns in chaos. And one of those patterns is faces. It does not take a lot for us to perceive a face. And you can take a look at this because if you take a look at cars and these car experts, it's not too hard to see the faces in cars. So this is a rather pleased car over here. We can even identify the emotions of cars because we have the eyes right there. We have the nose right there. We have the mouth right there. We have all the components of a face that's required for a face to be activated. So if you see a face in a stimulus, that means that your fusiform face area is starting to activate. And it could be that car experts are just really good at identifying cars because they've hijacked their fusiform face area by seeing the faces in cars. So we have cars that are very, very happy cars, right? We have cars that are very, very anxious cars, right? And you might say to yourself, well, that's just some cars, right? What about this car over here? You know, does this car actually have a face? And again, cars, stimuli, it does not take a lot to perceive a face. One of the studies that that was done in the lab when I was at UNR was about what does it take in order to see a face. And what they found is it takes 2 dark regions and a line. And that is it. If you just randomly have like 2 dark regions and a line, that will activate you seeing a face. So you might be sitting here going, well, where's the face? Well, if you're a car expert, you'll see the face, and the face is right there. So we literally have eyes, nose, mouth, teeth, right? And if you can see that, your fusiform face area in your brain just lit up. So there's faces in cars. Maybe that's why car experts are so good at recognizing cars. And then what about the bird experts? Well, birds have faces. I mean, that just goes, that's common knowledge. So we got this bird over here. And again, we can not only identify that it's a face, it also triggers our identification of facial emotions, right? So this bird looks angry. This bird looks like you just said something that it really disagrees with, and it's about to yell at you, right? This bird over here, once again, well, maybe just all birds look angry. This one also looks angry. Well, this one looks angry and surprised, right? But they have faces. They have eyes, they have a nose, they have a mouth, and they have faces like our faces, right? 2 eyes on the other side, mouth below the nose. So again, the face-like quality of these bird faces might be what makes a bird expert a bird expert. They are just able to see the face in the birds that they identify. All right, and just to kind of show you the difficulty in a lot of neuropsychology studies in terms of trying to choose stimuli that do not have face-like qualities to them, it is very difficult because, again, our brains, our minds, try to force the world to fit our notions of it, our predisposed ways of thinking of it. And one of the things that we are predisposed to see are faces. So you can see faces in candle holders, these really, really scared candle holders. You can see faces in this incredibly happy telescope. You can see faces in this concerned sink. You can see faces in this really happy seat, just waiting for somebody to come and sit down. One of the ones that everybody has in their home, we have some right here in this room, is the electrical socket, right? That always looked kind of worried to me, like you were going to plug steel into its face, right? I mean, it triggers that facial perception. And it can happen almost anywhere. So here, we just have pots sitting on a stove, and just the reflection makes it look like a very, very contented pot, right? So if you're putting together an experiment and you're choosing stimuli, complex stimuli, it's the possibility that there's a face hidden somewhere in that stimuli. And if your subjects see that face, it's going to activate their fusiform face area, and maybe that's what we're seeing in these studies. So it doesn't take much. 3 birds can be a face. A hat can be a face. Iggy Pop can be 2 faces, right? Just in case you can't see it. It can happen anywhere, right? And now you'll never be able to unsee it, right? But it can happen anywhere, and that's the challenge. So that's the reason why this study was not the be-all and end-all of, for people looking away, you can look now. That's why this study is not the be-all and end-all of this, debate, and further studies were needed. And the challenge for this is really, if you want to show that fusiform face area is for faces only, it's only for face-like things, then you need to show that it responds to faces. That's been done. It definitely responds to faces. You need to show that it responds to untrained faces. So the thing about faces is that they're faces and they're trained. If you want to make the argument, the strong argument that the fusiform face area responds to faces, not just things that are trained, you need to show that it responds to untrained faces. And where do you get those? Well, that is very difficult. Maybe use the interracial identification phenomenon, where we are worse at identifying faces outside of our own race and much better at identifying differences within our own race. But that still might not be different enough or untrained enough. And then if you also want to do this, you have to show that the fusiform face area does not respond to trained complex objects that lack faceness. So you got to find some experts who are trained experts on identifying a complex stimulus that does not look at all like a face. So maybe chess experts for the pieces on a chessboard. But then you need to go in and eliminate all the possible configurations where the pieces are in an array that might look like a face. It's a very, very complicated type of study to do. So that's to show that the fusiform face area is for faces only. If you want to show that it's actually for complex stimuli, and faces are just a special case of a complex stimuli, you need to show that it will respond to trained complex stimuli that lack faceness. You need that key finding of these trained stimuli, these complex stimuli, that in no way can even be thought of as having the sort of structure of a face. All right, so that's our wrap up of the Greebles study. Any questions or comments before we go on to signal detection? All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to switch gears. We're staying in perception, but now we're going to start taking a look at signal detection. And signal detection is basically, in the title there, it's your ability to detect a signal. So it's your ability to correctly say that if a signal is present, it's your ability to say, yes, it's there. And also, if a signal is absent, it's your ability to say, no, it's not there. So signal detection, you do signal detection if you ever did Where's Waldo, the Where's Waldo activity books. So if you're taking a look at Where's Waldo, you are trying to determine, number one, if he's there, where is he? Number two, for all the distractor ones here, that is actually not him. So it doesn't count if you basically say, well, there he is, easy peasy. But we're really looking for a way of understanding, how do we know when something is there? And how do we know when something is not there? And signal detection was a procedure that really opened up our ability to study this sort of basic perceptual phenomenon. All right, so what we're going to do today to introduce signal detection is we're going to take a look at the visual search CogLab, the CogLab number 3. Then we'll take a look at the principles of signal detection. And then that'll lead us into the CogLab specifically on signal detection, the signal detection CogLab. And then we'll take a look at some of the implications, if we have time, implications of signal detection. What's one of the ways to apply it to the real world to answer really important questions and to help make important differences. All right, so visual search. So this is CogLab number 3. So the circles and squares of various colors were shown on the screen, and your task was to detect a signal. Your task was to detect a green circle among the shapes. Either say, yes, a green circle is there, or no, a green circle is not there. So if it was present, the green circle is there. If it was absent, the green circle was not there. And there were 2 variables in this experiment, the number of distractors. So you either had 4 distractors, or you had 16 distractors, or you had 32 distractors, or you had 64 distractors. So the number of distractors varied. It could increase from 4 to 64. So that was one variable, how many distractors was there. The other variable, though, was the type of search that was required. So the type of search could either be a feature search or what's known as a conjunctive search. And a feature search is where you can do the search by just looking for one feature. So in each of these conditions, your target was a green circle. That did not change. You were always looking for the green circle. But in the feature search, your distractors were blue squares. And what that means is that if you wanted to find that green circle, you could either look for something green, because everything else was a blue square, or you could look for something circle, because everything else was a blue square. So you didn't have to look for green circle. You could look for one feature. That's a feature search. The other one, conjunction search, you're still looking for green circles, but now the distractors are two forms of distractors. One are blue circles, and intermixed with these blue circles, you also had green squares. So now if you were looking just for green, you might find a green circle, or you might find a whole bunch of green squares. Now if you were looking just for a circle, you might find a green circle, or you might find blue circles. The only way that you can find that green circle is to look for both things at the same time. That's conjunction, both of them together. All right, so how many features do you need to search for in the feature search? We just went through that. Feature search, you're searching for one. Conjunctive search, you need to search for two things simultaneously. So let's take a look at an example of each of those. So what you would have is you would have this blank screen here. In most of these CogLab experiments, you will have that fixation point where they ask you to stay fixated here at the fixation point, and that just cleans up the data a little bit. That just makes it more standardized across everybody's experience, and that's what that fixation point is usually there for. But in this case, you might have this array pop up, and this would be conjunctive search for distractors, because you're looking for that green circle, but it's among green squares, so you can't just look for green, but it's also among blue circles, so you can't just look for circle. So that is for distractors with the green circle present. That is for distractors with the green circle absent, so you would have to indicate, yes, that is absent. Here we have 16 distractors with the green circle present, 16 with the green circle absent. Here we have 32 with the green circle present. It's right up there. 32 green circle absent. And then finally, 64 distractors with the green circle somewhere in there. It's right about there. And then 64 with the green circle nowhere in sight. So that was a conjunctive search condition. So what are the results of the conjunctive search? Well, that's the results for the conjunctive search right there. So here we have the number of distractors going all the way from 4 all the way up to 64. And then here we have the reaction times going from 0 all the way up to 1,000 milliseconds. So this is just 1 second here. And you can see that in the 4 distractor condition, you were pretty quick, 300 milliseconds. And then as the distractors increased, your time to find that green circle increased. And this is for the conjunction when the search was, when the target was present. So in this case, we can see that there's increased search time as the distractors, number of distractors increase. So that's when the target was actually present, and you have to do that conjunctive search. So far, so good? All right. Next one is when the target was not there. So how long does it take for you to search the array and decide, no, the target is not there? And that's the time that was required in order to decide that the green circle was not actually there. And does anybody, this gap here, does anybody know what the what that gap is actually measuring?
I think there was a hesitation section at the end of it.
Well, there definitely is a hesitation when you have to search and it's not there. So if you were doing a search and the target is not there, and let's say that we had, let's go with the big one here, let's go with 64 distractors. If you were doing a search for the green circle and the target is not there, and there's 64 distractors, How many distractors are you going to search before you give up your search?
128.
So you would go through twice? Okay. So there are different strategies for this, but let's go with what the minimum required would be. So what would the minimum requirement be if you're looking through 64 targets?
64.
It'll be 64. So 64 searches is the minimum that you would need to do in order to make sure that the target wasn't there, right? So this, we can think of this as being 64 searches. How many searches, on average, would you have to do when the target is there? So I'll give you a hint. Sometimes when the search popped up, the green circle might be the first thing that you looked at, right? You might just start searching through the array and boom, there's a green circle. You press present because you're looking for a green circle. You found a green circle. There's no need to search anywhere else. So sometimes it's going to be the very first target that you see. It's going to be the very first stimulus you look at. That's going to occur sometimes. Other times, it's going to be the very last one that you look at. So you're going to start looking through all of the distractors, and you're going to be like, no, 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 26, no, 27, no, 30, no, 40, no, 50, no, 60, no, 61, no, 62, no, 63, no, 64, no. There it is. It's the last one you look at. So sometimes it'll be the first. Sometimes it'll be the last. But on average, where's it going to end up? It's going to end up in the middle. It's going to end up being like the 32nd target that you look at. So sometimes you'll get lucky and it'll be before the middle. Sometimes you'll get unlucky, it'll be after the middle. But this is basically how long it takes you to search through 32 targets. So that difference there, that difference is your time to search half the array. You can actually go through the cognitive kind of logic of this and realize that that is your speed in this task of searching through 32 different distractors. All right, so we can see that in both cases here, though, and this is the important thing for the conjunctive search. In both cases, as the distractors increase in number, the reaction time, the time taken to either decide the green circle is not there or the green circle is there, those times increase as well. All right, so that's the conjunctive search. What about the feature search? What about the one where you're only looking for one aspect? You can either search for green or you can search for circle. Either one will work. So once again, 4 distractors, and the circle is present. 4 distractors and the circle is absent. 16 with the circle present. 16 with the circle absent. You'll notice I'm not even pointing out where the green circle is in this case because it is almost immediately apparent where it is, even in 32 distractors. And it's immediately apparent that it's absent, even in 32 distractors, and we go all the way up to 64, and you can see not here, but definitely right there. So it seems to be a different feeling in this situation for this feature search. So what are the results for the feature search? Well, here we have the old results for the conjunctive search. So what happens when the feature is there? How fast are you when the circle is actually there? Well, there are the times when the circle is actually there in the feature search. And as you can see, there is virtually no change in the search time as the distractors increase. You're just as fast with 4 distractors as you are with 64 distractors. And if you take a look at what happens when the target is not there in a feature search, you'll notice it's about the same pattern. And if you take a look at, remember we did the logic that this difference is your time to search half the array? Well, that difference right there is your time to search half the array when you're when you can do a feature search, when all you have to do is look for something green or look for something circle. All right, any questions on those results? All right, cool, because I got questions on those results. All right, so why are you better that is faster in the feature condition, or why are you slower in the conjunctive condition? And just to kind of, this will all tie into the same idea. What kind of processing is driving the feature condition, and what kind of processing is driving the conjunctive condition? So that's all part of this answer. So let's focus on this. What kind of processing is driving the feature condition? Does that pattern of results indicate parallel processing, or does it indicate serial processing? Parallel processing, exactly. So it doesn't matter how many distractors there were, did not increase the reaction time. That's an indication that you can process everything at once in that condition. Something about the feature condition just lets you process the entire screen as a whole because you can activate and use a parallel processor. On the other hand, for the conjunctive condition, what kind of processing is going on there? It's serial processing. And serial processing means that you have to go distractor by distractor until you find that target, and that is shown in the pattern of increasing time as the number of targets increase. So there's something about the feature condition that allows us to activate a parallel processing mechanism in our brain, and that's why we have that pattern of results. There's something in the conjunctive condition that doesn't allow that parallel processor to be activated, so we have to go piece by piece and use a serial processor. So we'll end this with a possible application for this. So does anybody know how we tend to use this in the real world? So any examples of where we would do a feature search or set up a feature search rather than a conjunctive search? So I'm thinking of a specific situation, but before I give you a hint, can anybody kind of think of where we try to induce a feature search rather than a conjunctive search? Mm-hmm.
When you're driving.
Okay, if you can elaborate.
Like, so you're just looking to see if anything is in your way, or like you're not looking for something specific.
Oh, okay, yeah, so that's a good example there. So when you're driving, you are looking for one particular feature. Is there something ahead of you? And you will react, and that's part of the reason why you react the same. If a child runs out in front of you, if a squirrel runs out in front of you, you will hit the brakes because you're searching for that one feature. Is it moving, and is it in the road? Sorry, is it in the road is the one feature. So that's a good example of a feature search. Any other possibilities? Yep.
Like at the grocery store, if you're looking for a specific brand, like within, I don't know, the cereal or something, you're looking for, one particular element.
Well, that's actually you're touching on a particular idea. That's the idea of the logo. That's the idea of mascots and logos. What they are is they're that one feature, that one thing that you can look for in order to find that particular product. And that's part of their appeal, especially for cereals. You'll notice that cereals have tons of easily distinguished mascots. And you'll also notice that almost none of them look the same, right? So the Trix Rabbit does not look like Tony the Tiger. Tony the Tiger does not look like Captain Crunch. Captain Crunch does not look like Count Chocula. And if you had to look for Captain Crunch versus, well, not Captain Morgan, but if you had Captain Crunch versus, Captain Crispy versus Captain Cookie versus this, that would be disastrous because that would require a conjunctive search, and you would take a long time going, well, I can't just look for captains. I got to look for these specific instances. All right, awesome. So that's where we're going to end the visual search, and that leads us into our next topic. And we'll see how far we can get on this today. But this is a vitally important kind of concept. This was borrowed from physics and applied to psychology, and really helped us understand a lot of how our basic kind of perceptual systems work. because in perception, remember that perception is the stimulation of the senses by an external stimulus. That's the experience that comes from that. Well, what is the sort of minimum we need to have that experience, right? What is the sort of basic properties that we need to have that experience? That's what signal detection tried to help us understand. So signal detection was used to measure the sensitivity of any perceptual system. So whether we're talking vision, audition, taste, any sort of perceptual system, it was used in analyzing radar systems. It was used in analyzing radios. Anything that's trying to pick up a signal, you can use signal detection to measure its sensitivity. So this means that we can use it to measure the sensitivity of an organism trying to detect or respond to an external stimulus. If the stimulus occurs, does the organism detect it? If the stimulus is not there, does the organism have the ability to say, no, it's not there? So in terms of signal detection theory, the big sort of measure that you get from it is called sensitivity. And sensitivity gets the symbol D prime. So call it sensitivity. Do not call it D prime. D prime does not mean anything. Sensitivity does. So that's sensitivity. And it's given that D symbol because it's literally the distance between two distributions that are in your mind. One is the signal distribution, and the other is the noise distribution. And you find these out by using a signal detection paradigm. So we're going to get into what these distributions are right now, but just remember that your sensitivity is a measure of the distance between these two distributions. The shorter the distance, the worse your sensitivity. The larger the distance, the greater your sensitivity. So that D prime is really a measure of how sensitive are you. The larger the distance, the larger D prime, the better your sensitivity. So let's start with the noise distribution first. So the noise distribution is it's a concept that is it's pretty straightforward, but is very nicely illustrated by a musical piece written by John Cage. So we're going to take a look at this musical piece, and this is a indication, this is a demonstration of the noise distribution in a piece called 433 for piano. And this is, not to toot my own horn, but this is one of the piano pieces that I can actually play. All right, you might have figured it out by now. It's silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So we're not going to listen to all of it. It's basically the same tune the whole way through. But that's what that was his composition. And what he was doing is he was bringing forth the noise distribution. He was, through this performance, bringing into focus the noise distribution that we all carry around. And the noise distribution is the noise that is in your system, in your perceptual system, when there is no stimulus present. So when no signal is present, when there is nothing out there, when there are no musical notes being played on a piano, there is still sound. There is still the hum of the recording device. There's still people breathing in the audience. There's still, just in your own mind, just in your own perceptual system, there's still random firing of neurons. So all of this was brought to focus in that piece 433, and that's what the noise signal is. It's what's going on in your mind. The noise distribution is what's going on in your mind when nothing is going on outside. There is no stimulus in the external world. What is going on in your mind? And just to give you another sort of example of this from John Cage's life, he was clearly fascinated with the idea of sound. He was fascinated with the idea of silence. And he realized that basically nowhere in this world can you experience true silence, right? Just about anywhere you go, there's the sound of something, right? Something's going on. Even in a country, in the middle of a field, you'll hear the wind, you'll hear birds chirping, you'll hear crickets. So there's almost nowhere that you can hear silence. So he heard about an anechoic chamber at Harvard University. This chamber that was specifically designed to cancel out all sound. It was sound insulated. It's where they did their sound experiments. It was insulated from the outside world. It had all those cones and everything to absorb any sound coming from inside the chamber. It was a chamber designed for complete silence. So this was from an interview, and I'll just read his quote. He goes to that anechoic chamber and hoping to hear sound for the first time, to hear silence for the first time ever. He goes, I heard two sounds, one high and one low. So he was disappointed. He walks into this place for the first time ever. He's going to hear silence. And lo and behold, he hears two sounds. So he goes, I heard two sounds, one high and one low. When I described them to the engineer in charge, he informed me that the high one was my nervous system in operation, and the low one was my blood in circulation. So it was so silent in that room that his perceptual system still had activity in it. It still had just the nervous system, just random firings of your neurons so that they can stay alive. And the blood that was flowing through his veins got picked up by his auditory system. So that is the noise. That's the noise distribution. Specifically, this activation of your nervous system in operation, that is the noise distribution. So the noise distribution, again, it is when absolutely no signal is present. It's the activation of your perceptual system when there is no signal present. All right, so let's take a look at this in graphic form. So this is a look into your mind. This is going to be a graph of your mind. And in your mind, we have here on the x-axis increasing amounts of evidence. So if you have ever thought you heard something, and you were like, oh my gosh, did I hear something or did I just imagine that? That means that you don't have enough evidence to decide, have you detected something or not? So if you think you hear a sound outside, if you don't know for sure, you don't have enough evidence. If you go, open the door, look outside, and you see like a squirrel in your backyard, well then you've increased your evidence and you can say, oh yeah, there it is. So this is the amount of evidence that you have to say whether something is actually there. And here we have the frequency of impression. And that just means how often do you have this much evidence? So in certain situations, how often do you have specific amounts of evidence? So we have these frequency distributions. We're going to start off with the noise distribution. And this is the distribution of evidence that you have when nothing is there. So usually when nothing is there, your perceptual system, your nervous system, is just randomly shooting off impulses. So there's always some noise in the system, right? There's always a little bit of chaos in the system. And usually it's at this level right there. Usually you have this much evidence being sent to you through your perceptual system. Sometimes your system is really just randomly on the low side of activation, right? It doesn't happen very often, not a high frequency. Sometimes your system is overactivated, right? It doesn't happen very often, not a high frequency. But this is the frequency with which certain amounts of evidence comes from just the operation of your nervous system, just the operation of your perceptual system. Everybody clear on that distribution there? Okay, so this is what happens. This is what is happening in your perceptual systems when nothing is going on outside. There is no signal. What happens when you get a signal is that the signal adds evidence to your perceptual system. The signal literally gives more evidence that something is there, and it moves your noise distribution to this new place, which is signal plus noise distribution. So now when something is there, sometimes you get very little evidence that something is actually there. Most of the times you have a pretty good amount of evidence that something is actually there. And then sometimes it's super obvious that something is actually there. You have a lot of evidence. And then the last piece that we need for this is we need a criterion. We need a level of evidence at which you will say, yes, something is there, and below which you will say, nope, I didn't detect anything. And that could be anywhere along this evidence platform. That's something that you choose internally, right? So if you want to be on the safe side, your criterion would be low. You would not require a lot of evidence. If you want to be on the aggressive side, it would require a lot of evidence. Depending upon the situation, you can move your criterion around. So that is the two distributions. And as it turns out, a measure of sensitivity of your system is the distance between the peaks. So that D prime that we talked about, that measure of sensitivity, that is the distance between those two peaks. The greater the distance, the more sensitive you are, the easier it is to determine is something there or something not there. The less distance there is, the smaller that D prime, the harder it is to make a correct decision. Is something there? Is something not there? All right, so has everybody got on the two distributions right now? Okay, let's break it up a little further. Let's go in a little bit more detail. So the noise distribution, that is the distribution, again, that's present in your perceptual system. Nothing is outside. So the correct answer, if it's just the noise distribution, the correct answer is nothing is there. And if you have an amount of evidence that is below the criterion, so very important, remember, above this criterion, above this line of evidence, you're going to say, yes, I heard something. Below this line of evidence, you're going to say, no, I didn't see anything. And when nothing is there, and the activation of your nervous system is below this line of evidence, then that is a correct decision, and we call that a correct rejection. So if somebody asks you, did you hear anything? And nothing was there, and you say, nope, I didn't hear anything, you reject that there's a signal, you're correct, hence correct rejection. However, notice that sometimes you have an overactive perceptual system. Doesn't happen very often, thank goodness, but sometimes your perceptual system gets a little overactive, gets a little noisy. And that's when you have those experiences where you turn to your friend and you say, did you hear that? And your friend says, no, there was nothing there. And you check it out, and there really wasn't nothing there. What you've done is you've made a mistake, and that is called a false alarm. So a false alarm is when you say, oh, I heard something, right? It went above criteria. False alarm, I heard something, but in actuality, nothing is actually there. So those are the two possible outcomes when there is no signal. When nothing is there, you can either correctly say, nope, nothing is there because the evidence in your mind fell below criterion. So you say nothing is there and you're right. Or the evidence in your mind fell above the criterion and you say, no, I heard something when it wasn't actually, nothing was there, and that's a false alarm. All right, so that's when nothing is there. What about when something is there? What about when there is a signal? What happens in that case? Well, first off, notice your criterion doesn't move because you do not know. Is there a signal or is there no signal? All you know is that you're getting a certain amount of evidence. So if you get evidence that's above the criterion, when the signal is present, and it's always going to be signal plus noise because you can't get rid of the noise, but when the signal is present, if the activation here is above criterion, you're going to say, I heard something. And you're going to be correct, and that's called a hit. And then the opposite of that is when the signal is there, but because your nervous system wasn't very noisy, didn't have a lot of activation, the evidence falls below the criterion, the signal is going to be presented, you're going to say, I didn't hear anything, and that is called a miss. So in this case, you can be correct and say, yes, it's there, that's called a hit, or you can be incorrect and say, no, it's not there, when it actually was, and that's called a miss. All right, any questions on that fundamental idea of, yep?
You said a hit is when, if the noise is above your criterion, or the signal and noise is above?
Yes,
criterion?
so the signal and noise above criterion is a hit. Yep. So signal and noise, so this is signal and noise together, and when it is above the criterion, that's a hit. But when it's below the criterion, you basically missed the signal, and that's why they call it a miss. And those are the four possible outcomes in any kind of signal detection scenario. It's either not there, and you can correctly say, no, it's not there, or you can incorrectly say, yes, I heard something, or it is there, and you can correctly say, yep, there it is, or you can incorrectly say, whoops, I didn't see it. And those are the things that we measure: hits, misses, false alarms, correct rejections, in order to measure this sensitivity up here. So you can recover this sensitivity. You can get a measure of this sensitivity by measuring the amount of correct rejections and false alarms, measuring the amounts of hits and misses, because you can see that as this increases, right, as your sensitivity increases, notice what happens. Your misses in this case go way down. So look how many misses we have for somebody with a low amount of sensitivity, and then look how many misses we have for somebody with a high amount of sensitivity, right? They're not missing a lot of signals. Most of the time when something is there, they're saying, yes, I heard that, because they have high sensitivity. So by taking a look at the ratios of hits and misses, false alarms, and correct rejections, you can discover where a person's sensitivity is. And the big breakthrough in signal detection, what it really allowed people to do in psychology, is to take the subjective cautiousness of people out of the equation. So what can happen is, let's say that it was absolutely critical that you got hits correct, right? It's absolutely critical that when something was there, you detected that it was there. What's a strategy that you could use if that's the most important thing? Whoops, I knew I was wrong. If that's the most important thing, what's the strategy that you could use if you were, for example, in a test and they said, all right, we really, really, really want you to make sure that every time a signal is there, you tell us that it's there. What's a strategy that you could use? Yep.
If you're like hitting the button, you could just repeatedly hit it, whether it's there or not.
Yeah, just hit the button all the time for every single trial. If they're like, was something there? You'd be like, yeah. And for trial number 2, was something there? Yeah. Trial number 3, did you see it? Sure, right? You're never going to miss it. You're never going to get a miss. You're going to be killing the false alarms, right? You're going to have false alarms all over the place. But you can see that your strategy, your cautiousness can really affect the numbers of hits and correct rejections and misses that you get. And what that basically means is that your criterion, where you set it, will change your hits, will change your misses, will change your false alarms and correct rejections. However, and this is where one of the big kind of powers of signal detection theory, it doesn't matter where you move your criterion, because it will affect your hits and your false alarms, because it will affect your correct rejections and and your misses, you can still recover the same amount of sensitivity. So you can measure a person's sensitivity if they are highly conservative, if they are highly aggressive, highly conservative, if they're being cautious, if they're not being cautious. It doesn't matter what they're trying to do. With signal detection theory, you can still measure how sensitive they are. You can get that bias-free measure of sensitivity. All right, so are there any questions on the basics of signal detection? Okay, so we got about 10 minutes left, but we're not going to be able to do the next section in 10 minutes, and I do want to make sure that we do this all in one piece. Otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave it here for this week. But what I would like you to do to kind of really start to make sense of this signal detection theory is try to think of decisions in your daily life that you, and then apply signal detection theory to those decisions, right? And what I mean by that is try to identify what would a hit be, what would a miss be, what would a correct rejection be, what would a false alarm be. And the power of signal detection comes from the fact that so many of our decisions in life, so many of our behaviors in psychology can be thought of in these terms. So I'll just give you an example, something that's coming up for all of you if you're going to go to grad school, right? Think about your grad school applications. It would be wonderful if you could choose 100 grad schools that you wanted to go to and fire off 100 grad school applications. You're going to need thousands of dollars to do that. That's just not something that's feasible for most students. So what do you need to do? You need to choose. Which grad schools am I going to apply to? Which grad schools am I not going to apply to? And you also have to start taking into account, am I going to be able to get into this program, or am I not going to be able to get into this program? So if you take a look at the program and you say, I could probably get into that program, you might apply to that one. If you look at a program and say, too competitive, I probably won't get in, you might decide not to apply to that program. What you're doing is you're doing signal detection. So if you will not get into the program and you do not send in an application, that's a correct rejection, right? You decided that I'm not getting in, so you said I'm not getting in and no application went in. However, if you do not apply to a program and you would have gotten in to that program if you applied, well, that's a miss, right? That's a miss in that case. You would have gotten in, signal, but you did not apply, that's a miss. If you apply to a program only to not get into that program, that's a false alarm, right? You had no signal, not getting in, but you applied, and that's a false alarm. But if you apply to a program and you get into that program, that's a hit, right? So you're going to try to maximize your hits. You're going to try to minimize your false alarms. You're trying to minimize your misses. You're trying to maximize your correct rejections. It's signal detection. So signal detection, just as one final thought, one of the challenges of signal detection is there's a lot of moving parts, right? We got noise distributions. We got signal plus noise distributions. We got sensitivity, criterion. We got 4 areas of the signal detection. So take a little bit of time over the next few days, and just as you go about your daily routine, when you make a decision of what to eat in the morning, right? Just kind of ask yourself, what would a hit be in this situation? What would a false alarm be in this situation? And that'll kind of help practice the signal detection ideas, so that when we meet here on Tuesday and we take up the rest of signal detection, it'll be a little bit more automatic in practice. But other than that, we are done for the week.